by my timepiece, otherwise known as I have 1:30 p.m. Eastern Time. So out of respect to everyone's schedule, we should probably begin today. I'd like to thank you for joining the conversation, and thank you for taking time out of your busy schedules to participate in this conversation. I've been looking forward to it for quite some time, and hopefully everyone will be amply rewarded for the time they spend with us. My name is Matt Kleinhens. I'm an extension specialist, vegetable crops with Ohio State University. I'm based at the Ohio Agricultural Research and Development Center, which is where I am today. My job in the next 90 minutes is to ensure that you are repaid for the time you spend in the conversation. Repaid first with information you can use, but also in recognition that your input is important and that we hope that you will join us going forward. So our immediate goal is to gain more completely from the philosophy and practice of soil balancing. Soil balancing is complex, it's prevalent, and it's shown a capacity to endure. It also raises very interesting and sometimes difficult to answer questions. All of those are reason enough for us to chat. But as we address those questions, we're also very likely to learn about soils, about crops, about farms and farmers, and the people who advise farmers and supply them. We will also discover what and how they observe and they come to claim as their specific knowledge and perspectives on farm management. So all of that in 90 minutes is way too ambitious a goal, right? But it's much more likely in 270 minutes. So I'd like to take this moment to mention again that we have two more call-in conversations scheduled, one on November 14th and the other on December 12th. And across the three, we hope to devote specific conversations to various topics within the bigger one of soil balancing overall. Those topics are also much too much for one person to address. So you will soon hear other voices. Today we're lucky to have 6 other experts to fuel that conversation, to fuel the discussion. Before I introduce them and open up the conversation, I'd like to cover 3 important bits of background. And this is going to take maybe 5 minutes or so, but it's table setting, it's background, and it's context. And it's important, and then eventually we will get to the point where I don't drone on and you get to hear from other people. There are only 2 simple ground rules for the call. First, we muted all of you. To be heard, you need to mute yourself. And to unmute yourself, in case you do not know, you need to press *6 on your hand. That will unmute you. So when you need or feel a desire to speak up, please do so by pressing *6. And then when you're done saying your piece, if you can, please remute yourself by pressing *6 again. This will help minimize the background noise and possibly prevent you from having an embarrassing moment. This is the 5th of these calls, the 7th, calls that I've hosted on various topics, and there have been an occasional embarrassing moment from somebody not muting their phone. So just be mindful. Next, please listen carefully, but also speak up when invited or when you feel the need, like I mentioned. Our panel of resource people will certainly add to the discussion, but your input, whether it's a comment or a question, is very, very important. And also, if you choose not to speak up right here on the call, you can drop us a comment or a question online during the call. The URL for that is go.osu.edu/SBnow. That again is go.osu.edu/SBnow. That link is going to remain active after today's, so please use it to share feedback about the call also. So I'm moving on to the second bit of background. Okay. This call is possible because of support from a grant from the USDA OREI, Organic Research and Extension Initiative. That support has been essential to the conduct of this call and all other activities that we will describe around it. We'd also like to thank the individuals and organizations that help bring you and other people to the conversation. Our partners at SARE, at Acres, at Farm and Dairy, and a number of grower organizations nationwide have been very kind to share announcements about the discussion and the OSU-led effort to help improve people's understanding of soil balancing. So, for example, you can see the Acres USA Eco Farming Daily blog today, available at ecofarmingdaily.com for more information about that effort. The third bit of background. You may be wondering who else is on the call. We cannot share specific information about individuals, of course, but you might recall the information you shared when registering. And from that, I can say that the registrants represent 11 states, 3 countries, and various universities, businesses, and organizations. Also, most people are directly involved in sustainable organic farming in some way. So as you speak up or post a comment or a question, please feel free to introduce yourself, say where you are from, and how you come to be interested in soil balancing. So that completes the background, and we'll unmute everyone to ask if there are any questions before we get to introductions and the topic of the day. Are there any questions about the background, the context, or the process? Okay.
Could you repeat the URL?
Yes, I can. Be happy to. go.osu.edu/SBNow. That should bring you to a page where there's a form, not a form, but a field for you to post a comment or question.
The SBS, perhaps, sorry.
SB is case sensitive. I apologize. It's capital S, capital B, now.
Lowercase now.
Lowercase now. I'm used to case sensitive URLs, so I apologize for that. So again, it's go.osu.edu/capital S, capital B, lowercase NOW.
Thank you.
Sure, thank you. Any other questions about background, context, so forth? Otherwise, we'll get on to into the conversation. Okay. Along with you, the call-in participants, with your own experience, we have 6 people committed to serving as resource people today in alphabetical order. They are Steve Coleman of The Ohio State University, Doug Doohan of The Ohio State University, Will Glazik of Cow Creek Organic Farm, Doug Jackson-Smith of The Ohio State University, John Kemp of Advancing Eco-Agriculture, and Bill McKibben of Soil Tech. And I want to extend a personal thanks to those 6 folks for committing to being here with us and to providing their input on a whole range of topics that we will get into. They are here to help us address 2 main topics. The first is how farmers and scientists develop and use knowledge, especially as those processes relate to soil balancing. The second main topic is a broad description of soil balancing. We are not here to define it. We are probably here more to talk about it and to describe it, but paying specific attention to its history and its potential utility in farm management. We may cover topics such as what it broadly is and what it broadly is not, what it broadly has been, what it broadly may be. Big questions of that sort. So, Will, you're on the line with us from Illinois, and you've been combining, and sounds like you're pulling off a great crop, which is good to hear. I'd like to have you comment first, if you were willing. You're a member of the Idea Farm Network. It's impressive, from my standpoint, it's impressive how members of that network work to improve their farms, including through sharing what they learn. So if you wouldn't mind first taking just a minute to summarize your farming operation, and then I'll follow up with you, follow up with a question for you. Will, remember that you need to press *6 to unmute yourself.
Can you hear me?
Now we can hear you. Yeah.
Okay.
Go ahead. Thanks. Yeah, just a minute or so on your farm.
Yeah, it's fifth generation family farm. My brothers and I are the second generation farming organic. My parents are still living and part of the operation. We have 640 acres certified organic with livestock as well. We run a rotation of corn, soybeans, and small grains, including wheat, oats, rye, and we're trying barley. And we mainly have grass-fed cattle along with 3 sows, so a handful of hogs, and a few chickens.
So with such a complex, large operation, obviously a long-standing one as well, Will, would you be willing to describe overall how you use input from other people, researchers, farmers, consultants, whomever, coupled with your own experience, how you use all that input when you make a decision regarding soil management? Overall.
Yeah, so I tried to listen to a lot of different people, and some of the experiences coming straight from farmers, they tend to carry more weight than even researchers. And then you try to see what they did and how they're able to improve their farming operation, whether it's management technique or an input or a difference in rotation. And then, I don't know, try to figure out how you can make that work on your own operation, because everyone's farm is going to be a little bit different, and what works for one person might not work for another, but you can still end up getting to a similar goal by being able to try it and bring it back to your own farm.
So you mentioned, Will, that you put more weight on maybe the input you receive, from other farmers, what you observe on those farms, more so than you put on, say, what researchers might have to say. Can you speak at all to what you may look to researchers for to add to that mix?
Yeah, I think that researchers, they do a really nice job of taking what the farmers learn from experience and narrowing down the why, so we can have a greater understanding of why the farmers are able to witness that experience, and then it's easier to replicate when we know the more of the reasons why rather than just the how. Okay,
and I don't want to continue to put you on the spot. I'd like to turn to John next if it's okay, but Will, before I let you go for now, if there's a difference between the input that you might be getting from farmers or other people that you trust, very much, and the research community, is that easy to resolve for you? Is the decision on how to use those, make sense out of those differences, is that pretty straightforward for you to resolve?
Could you maybe repeat that a little bit different?
Yeah. So let's say I don't want to. If there's something within the research community, what the researchers say that's somewhat in conflict or differs from the experience that farmers are bringing forward, is the way forward for you easy in light of that? Or are you ever stuck by the difference between what you're hearing out of the universities and what you're hearing from on the farm?
Oh, yeah. I mean, if the universities have a different opinion than the farmers, I normally go with the farmer opinion. They may not know why something's working, but they do know that it does. And maybe the researchers don't have all of the, if they're just doing double-blind studies where they're removing one or adding something, they may not have the whole system where a farmer would have a whole system, and he's not really running a replicatable study, but he knows that he can learn from his experiences. And those are the kind of things that we share on the Idea Farm Network. And if anyone has more questions about that later on, I'd be happy to add them. It's just a learning community. of farmers sharing experiences.
No question. I know I've gained from watching the threads come by through the network, and my guess is that, as you said, that it's no problem, I go with what the farmer says. There were probably about 50 heads nodding wherever they might be sitting, and others who might listen to this call after it's posted, nodding and understanding and agreement that probably, of course, you'd go with what the farmers are saying, if you will. So John Kemp, I know that you've also been in a position to collect a lot of different input, both from reading and from direct observation and so on. How do you bring that all together in forming the comments that you share or the recommendations that you might offer? Is there a pecking order? Is it just I don't call it random, but is it just a case-by-case basis where you kind of make an amalgam of the input that you're seeing on an important subject?
I'm not sure I understand the context of your question, Matt. Are you referring to specific agronomic recommendations, or are you referring to the differences between farmers and researchers' perspectives? So
you offer a lot of constructive input on management decisions, and sometimes even in the form of a recommendation. And those have been constructed from your reading widely and talking widely and observing widely. With all that input that comes in, I was kind of approaching it from the same standpoint I did with Will. How do you bring all that input together into one coherent, maybe recommendation or offer of input?
Big question, Matt. And I'll describe the process that we use, the thought process that we use a little bit, and a little bit of background context as well. I'd like to also say thank you for instigating this conversation and for inviting me to participate, because I think it's an important conversation that is very needed in many different areas. So a bit of background and context with our consulting work, currently working on several thousand farms across the country, ranging all the way from sandy soils in California to very heavy clay soils in North Dakota and calcareous soils and just about everything in between that you can imagine. Most of the crops that we're working with are high-value fruit and vegetable crops, but also a lot of broadacre grain crop production. And our process for soil balancing on all those various farms is a combination of 3 different types of analysis in the laboratory, combined with visual observation and field observation, field experience. So for the laboratory analysis, we would use we're familiar and use both ammonium acetate and melic-3 extraction tests, commonly referred to as a CEC, or percent-based saturation cation exchange test. Then we also use saturated paste analysis, and in the last 2 years, we have begun using many more Haney soil analysis, which I think the challenge with soil testing and soil balancing is that soil science is still a very highly imprecise science, which is one of the reasons why we have such a broad diversity and type of different tests, is that there's a lot we're still figuring out. And when seeking to develop a really healthy soil ecosystem, there are 3 different aspects that we need to manage well. We need to manage the soil's structure and the physical characteristics. We need to manage soil mineral balance and chemistry, and we need to manage soil biology. And the challenge with soil analysis, as done historically with CEC analysis, is that they only measure the mineral component. They don't give good credence to the physical structure or to the biology. And obviously all 3 are very interrelated and interdependent. So this has been one of the foundational reasons for us beginning to work much more closely with the Haney analysis, is we find that particularly for the biology component, it gives more credence to what is happening with soil biology, and as a result has been the least inconsistent in correlating with actual crop results and in-field results. So, Matt, I'm not sure if that answered your question or the question that you were asking well.
It certainly helps. I mean, I simply was trying to scratch a tiny bit beneath the surface on how, there seems to be no lack of information, no lack of input on certain topics, including soil balancing. One can consult a lot about what's been written and what is being said, and if you do that, it's likely that you'll encounter disagreements, if you will. And I was simply asking you and Will to start, and I'll turn to Bill and Steve. I was simply asking the two of you to comment on how, you might prioritize the input, right?
Okay.
Not that you're saying somebody is wrong or somebody else is right, anything along those lines.
Yep.
It's just like Will said it well. Hey, if there happens to be a disagreement, I'm going to side with what's happening on the farm.
Yes, I would agree with Will's comment, and I would like to add one thought also in terms of prioritizing inputs. The number one goal, the number one objective needs to be to grow a really healthy crop. That's the priority. That's the thing that we have to be focused on. And a challenge that I have observed in some areas of agronomy historically, and this seems to have shifted recently, which I'm very happy about, has been that the objective and the goal was to create a nicely balanced soil report rather than to grow a really healthy crop. And so in terms of priorities, sometimes the lab report might indicate that we have a soil that is severely out of alignment and we need to make major adjustments, but the budget doesn't exist and it's not possible to make that happen. In those cases, the priority is and always needs to be to grow a really healthy crop first and then fix the soil over time as we're able to.
Fair enough. John, I'll put the question to Bill if I can. I'll redirect from John to Bill. The soil test report history, and John, I want to make sure I capture what you said correctly, so if I don't, speak up. Soil test report reports don't necessarily speak directly to growing a healthy crop, and in the eyes of some, those reports may not be a path to healthy crops, which is me as a university guy, my understanding of what they're supposed to do. They're supposed to serve as a path towards healthy crops. Bill, I mean, what's your take on interpreting a soil test report within the context of balancing, for example, and getting to that healthy crop that John is referring to?
Well, first of all, can you hear me now? Am I keyed in?
Very well.
Okay.
Yep.
I like the basis of the soil reports, but I do tend to agree with John in that if I look at tissues and I look at results in the field, things like the paste analysis has given me a much better feel for what the plants are seeing. And so I think that my goal is to look at a soil overall, the overall balance through a standard soil test, and because that's telling me what is there, what's available to move into solution, which would be more available to the plant. So I don't want to misdirect anybody and say, well, the soil test is not good. It's a good starting basis. It's a good direction. But just because you have pretty good soil balance doesn't mean that those nutrients are going into solution. So, and I've learned this through 40 years of experience. I've made plenty of mistakes, so I can see how that has really helped my business and understanding crop production by looking and saying, okay, I've got a great balanced soil, but I'm not performing quite to the level that I want. And when I start looking at the paste analysis or solubility analysis, that's what really narrows it down for me to direct inputs for the farmer.
I think it was well said. John, I think you might have been the first to invoke biology, chemistry, and physics, the structure of the soil. But I know that Doug Doohan, Steve Coleman, I'm sure others, are very, very interested in the influence of soil balancing-like approaches on the structure of the soil, perhaps particularly as it may influence the infiltration, the rate at which water can infiltrate, essentially improve internal drainage. And that actually is one of the questions that is a question that somebody submitted along with the registration, and that is the role of soil balancing and in water infiltration. Bill, if it's okay, I'd like to put that question to you first, having traipsed across as many acres as you have, and then maybe we can turn to Doug and Steve to follow up comment on that specific question, soil balancing and water infiltration.
Sure. I think that when you look at the soil balance, and I'm basically grew up as an Albrecht guy, looking at that base saturation at 65% calcium, 15% magnesium. And if you look at the texture triangle with the sand, silt, and clay, that bottom part of the texture triangle where you've got a high concentration of sands or silts, that base saturation thing doesn't work. It works better as we push up into the clay content. And so, and when we do that, when we get more and more clays, I mean, the whole idea of base saturation was to balance the soil so that we could flocculate clays. By flocculating clays, we get better aeration, we get better water holding capacity, and ultimately improve biological activity. So it's like a stack of dominoes. You improve one, the others kind of fall in place.
So, Bill, before we turn to Doug, if I could interject real fast, you mentioned that you grew up as an Albrecht guy. For those that may not be familiar with what it means to be an Albrecht guy, would you be willing to summarize real quickly and then follow that up with clarifying whether you remain an Albrecht guy?
Oh, well, the Albrecht philosophy is that balance of cations. Like I said, the 65% calcium, 15% magnesium, 4, 5, 6% potassium. And I still follow that, and I am still an Albrecht guy. But I look at the Albrecht philosophy and say that is not the end game now. If you're going to move to the next level, you're going to look at solubility. You're going to look at paste analysis and see what's moving into solution. Because I've had too many experiences where I look at these fields and I say, hey, they're in great balance, and production is not there. And I've had a number of farmers say, well, you had me put lime on, and my neighbor never puts any lime on, and he gets as good as yields as I do. But going back and looking at that solubility has really, I would say, opened my eyes to the fact that the Albrecht philosophy is not the end game.
To balance is not the goal. To have a healthy crop and a good yield is the goal. Is that accurate to say it that way?
Well, and I don't want to disagree necessarily with John, but I look at I hear a lot about nutrient dense and healthy crops and stuff, and that's certainly one of the goals that we want. But ultimately, my clients are getting paid by volume. Now, whether you're an organic guy or you're a commercial or a regular commercial fertilizer guy, you're getting paid by the amount that you can produce. I mean, I don't know that even in the organic side that they're differentiating. Well, this has more vitamin C or more calcium or anything. It's just based on the classification. So, I'm still geared towards the profit side of it and saying, I'd like to have a healthy crop, and I think by using the soil balance And those things, my guys are much better, but they're not getting paid for that at this point.
Fair enough.
Bill, I agree with you, and I would define a healthy crop as a high-yielding crop. That was what I intended to communicate, so we're in perfect alignment.
Good.
Fair enough. Doug Doohan, let's bring this back to water infiltration and soil balancing. I know that that's a bit of an interest of yours, and you've done some work on it. It perhaps has piqued your interest in the past and holds it still now. Are you able to comment on soil balancing and water infiltration, perhaps especially from the historical perspective, of input you've received from farmers over the years that may have kind of driven them to soil balancing, if you will? And Doug, you may need to hit *6 to unmute if you haven't.
Hi. Am I coming through?
Yeah, you're coming through now.
Yeah, okay. I guess I thought I just needed to hit the mute button, but apparently that doesn't cut it on its own.
Yeah, *6.
So you do need the *6. Yeah. So I think the first thing that we would want to say is that we definitely do not have data looking at any possible relationship between water infiltration and the occurrence or lack of occurrence of weeds. But there are a number of observations that we have made with the assistance of farmers that I think line up, sort of a very bold arrow pointing us in that direction that there really is a connection between water infiltration and the presence of weeds. And I think at the most simple level where this would function, and again, the data doesn't exist, but I do feel fairly strong that as we reduce flooding in the fields and anoxic conditions, lack of oxygen in the soil, we end up with a healthier crop, and in many cases a crop that survives versus a crop that dies out under flooding conditions. And as a result, fewer weeds, because when the crop dies or when the crop is not vigorous, what grows in those areas of the field are weeds primarily. And we've all seen those dead areas in the field that come up in foxtail and other weeds. And I was taking some pictures of places that were flooded in the spring that are now full of weeds. I was doing that last week. So I think that this also relates back to some work that we did 10 to 15 years ago, looking at farmers' attitudes and notions and perceptions about weeds, and why we had weed problems. And in doing that, we interviewed several university weed scientists, probably about a half a dozen or more, and then we interviewed about 25 farmers. And these are in-depth interviews that are very open-ended and allow the farmer to really explore their own thinking on the subject. And the big difference between the university professors, who are very respected in their field, and the farmers in terms of their notion about why weeds were a problem, why weeds spread, why they occur in the field, had to do with what the farmers just simply called flooding. And initially, I thought this was really the spread of weeds along estuaries and riverbanks and that sort of thing. But what I've come to realize is almost certainly what the farmers were referring to was flooding conditions in the field where you have standing water. So if using a soil balancing approach, getting your calcium levels up where they are approaching and in the level that Albrecht promoted, there's a good reason to believe that we are going to have a soil where ponding water is less of a problem. And I think that very likely farmers, perhaps they're seeing other things about weeds, but they are definitely seeing that because they have less of that, they have fewer weeds over the long term.
So the hard data that you referred to may not exist. Between the water infiltration and weeds may not exist. But Steve, you'll have to clarify. There are hard data regarding soil chemistry and soil structure or infiltration rate, and that's something that you're looking closely at. What should we know there?
Well, there's been some work in the past that's looked at the role that calcium plays in terms of, as Bill alluded to, the flocculation of clays and formation of soil structure. We know that divalent cations like calcium, magnesium do play a disproportionately larger role in terms of bridging those clay particles and forming organic matter, the kind of the quote-unquote birthplace of organic matter, how it forms, how it starts. Some of the question in the literature in terms of the science revolves around the differences between calcium and magnesium in terms of those roles. And so there's still, a fair amount of work that could be done in terms of trying to tease apart the differences, if any, between those two. I'd be happy to just mention, if appropriate, some of the data that we've got from our sites that our field sites. I know, this isn't a research reporting forum, but we do have our fourth year of a couple different certified organic field crop sites in the state, one on a heavier soil, Hoytville clay, and one on a lighter soils here in Worcester. And we found that there's increased infiltration in our calcium amended plots relative to our magnesium amended plots. So, we have the good fortune as researchers to kind of try to balance soils and then try to screw them up and see if these extreme differences, we can actually find some differences in, trying to make some sense of this and measure that. And we have found just this summer, for the first time really, that we found greater infiltration in the calcium amended plots versus the magnesium amended. And so that is, we're very excited about that finding. I think that's, it's something that brings some validation in terms of a lot of this anecdotal farmer testimony, a lot of the farmers that, we have talked to talking about this. So we're going to be repeating these measurements to see, hopefully we can, in the next, within the next week, and hopefully we can see this not just in the summer, but also see this repeated measurement in the fall. I will mention that on our lighter soils here in Worcester, we did not see the same result. So it's really that increased infiltration has only happened on heavier soils in those Hoytville clays. So.
Excellent. So Steve mentioned that this isn't necessarily, a forum for research results. And in fact, it very much can be. But I want to hit the pause button very, very briefly and mention that the next two calls, one in November and one in December, they are probably better positioned as summaries of the research that Ohio State has led in recent years around soil balancing. We do hope you stay tuned and participate in those calls. We're not ignoring those data today. As a matter of fact, the next person I'll turn to here is Doug Jackson-Smith, and we'll invite him to pick up where Steve left off on some of the research results. The main topics today are how people come to know what they know, what they prioritize, particularly within the soil balancing context, and as much as needed, a look back on soil balancing to understand where it came from to possibly help explain its potential future. But turning to Doug Jackson-Smith, one real advantage that the Ohio State team has, and I think you'll appreciate it as you hear more from Doug, is that he and Caroline had an opportunity to spend a lot of time with growers and others, talking with them about soil balancing and other related topics. And so, Doug, I'll just turn to you next. I mean, we've been addressing this one registrant's question, soil balancing and water infiltration, right? It seems as if there is a signal of sorts that chemistry will influence soil structure, will influence water infiltration rate, that may have follow-on effects. But you spoke with a lot of growers, and in previous conversation you were sharing some of the results from that. What else have you learned as far as what growers say of the benefits of soil balancing?
Well, I appreciate the opportunity to be part of a project like this that is at the university, but that very much is invested in building relationships with and co-learning with people who are out working in the field, both consultants who advise farmers or work with farmers, but also with farmers. And as Matt said, we've had a chance through this project to go out and interview a fairly large number of people who are working in this space, as well as do some survey work, which we'll report on in our next phone call. But the one thing that I think comes through clear, well, I'll make 2 points, and I'll answer your question in the second point. The first point is that soil balancing in practice is a lot easier to define in principle than it is to define in practice. And so we were overwhelmed with the complexity of the practice of soil balancing as compared to a fairly simple idea, if you will, to use Bill's phrase, this sort of old original Albrecht idea, which if you read Albrecht turns out to be more complex than people give it credit for. But the practice is rich, and it includes more than just chemistry and balancing calcium and magnesium, but also many of the things that John, Bill, and Will talked about. But we also found that universally people see results from using a variety of interventions that we might associate with either a narrow or a broad version of soil balancing. Most common in the interviews, at least we've conducted, are results around this issue of soil qualities. Phrases like flocculated soils, mellow soils, light soils, or tight soils are keywords that reflect a range of things that people talk about. They may or may not have a clear idea as to what's happening in the soil that's causing those kinds of outcomes, but very clearly there's a pattern in terms of their observations and physical experiences working with soil. They also talk about issues of crop quality as much as they talk just about crop yield. And I think it's important that if you will, on the spectrum of soil balancers, the more committed and serious people who really follow what they'll call a soil balancing philosophy are after goals that go beyond more than yield, that they tend to be managing holistically both the soil and their farm operation as a whole, and so that they're looking at outcomes and talk about a wide variety of outcomes.
So one other person asked in registering, is this a valid theory or is it just more chicken soup for the soil? I'd like to put that to people on the line. This is an opportunity for you to unmute yourself, push *6, and don't everybody speak at once, but do speak up. From your perspective, whatever experience level you have, we'd like to hear it. Is it a valid theory, or is it, quote, more chicken soup for the soil? And chicken soup is not bad. Chicken soup is quite good. But Doug Jackson-Smith mentioned that it's, I believe, more difficult to define in practice than in principle. So we don't farm in principles necessarily. We actually have to make decisions. And Will, you set us off really well by outlining the kind of decisions that you would face managing the 600-plus acres that you do as a family operation. And Bill, you work with folks like Will and others. And we have, I believe, a number of folks that can relate very well to the university people. There are other university people on this call. We have people who can relate well to Bill, I believe, based on their stated role. And we certainly have people that can relate to Will quite well. I should say Bill and John, relate to Will quite well because they're also farming for a living. So do we want to take 2 minutes or 5 minutes and address the question collectively of whether or not the theory is valid, or is it chicken soup, or just what is it anyway? You can speak up at will. If we have too much, we'll have to police it, but that would be a good problem to have. If nobody speaks up, I'll have to finger somebody and get their specific input. Valid theory or chicken soup? John, care to weigh in?
I'll be happy to jump in, Matt. What I've observed in the farms that we've worked on is simply that when soils are properly balanced, we get higher yielding crops, we get higher quality crops, and we also get increased, changes in weed populations. So I thought Doug's comments were very appropriate, very much in alignment with what we've observed in the field. And I think the key perspective from there's a lot of, I've heard a lot of claims being made about developing environments that are less conducive to weeds. And I think it really goes back to the fact that it's more, weeds are present or more vigorous in environments that are not just improperly mineral balanced, but that also have physical challenges and biology challenges that could be a result of soil compaction or flooding, etc. So I think it comes back to managing all those three pieces. And from a farm performance perspective, I have observed very few farms. In fact, I can't recall any off the top of my head who started doing soil balancing work only to a year or two down the road say that I haven't seen any performance, I haven't seen any results.
So, John, if I could press you just one tiny bit further before we move on to another voice, is your use of balancing in this way Albrechtian in nature, or is it more does it encompass more?
I would say it has an Albrecht Foundation with two modifiers. The first modifier is when making recommendations on how to achieve balance, to take into consideration what the soil biology may be able to deliver, and therefore perhaps adjusting amendments to take the biological response into consideration. If one type of amendment, let's say you have two different sources of calcium, I'll use limestone and gypsum as a crude example, very crude example, but limestone may bring the soil into the balance that we're looking for a bit more rapidly, but gypsum may produce a much more rapid crop response because of being more bioavailable to the soil biology and actually having biology act upon it faster. So we take into consideration the biological response, and we take into consideration the need to deliver nutrients, including calcium, magnesium, etc., to the next crop or the next immediate crops that we're growing. So with those two modifiers, I would say a system that is very solidly based on the Albrecht philosophy.
Okay. So another registrant asked the following question. Why has soil balancing not been more widely accepted by universities? I'm going to say if. We're not doubting the claims made by growers. I don't know why we would doubt the claims made by people who are farming the soil for a living. Sometimes it's an open secret that some of the responses that have been mentioned have not been, we as a university community have largely been unable to replicate them. Okay, using the approaches that we do, some of which Steve alluded to, we've been unable to replicate the findings that a number of people have expressed here. So we started this part of our conversation was asking whether or not it's a valid theory or chicken soup. We've heard quite credible claims of improvements when a soil balancing-like philosophy is used. It's an open secret that it's largely a theory that's not taught in our classes. I say our classes, university classes. It's not present in extension programs. It's not seen as being able to hold up to the claims that are made about it. And I don't know if anyone in particular, maybe I could turn to Steve, maybe I could turn to Doug, anybody on the call, doesn't have to be one of the six, okay? They are, all kidding aside, they are committed to serving as resource people today and quite knowledgeable, but we'd love to hear more voices. Why hasn't it been accepted more by universities?
Matt, I'd like to jump in on that just for a minute.
Okay.
And I think, you look at when a lot of this research was done, that was back in the 40s, 50s. and you look at the land-grant colleges, where they're located, and I think that has some impact on it. I mean, if you look at, let's just go around the country here. You look at Florida; those are all coral-based soils. You get on the East Coast, there are a lot of sands. You get down in Texas A&M, they were always a big competition for us in soil testing, or the soil competition. And, there's a lot of high calcareous soils down there. You get in different locations, even look at Ohio State, look at your guys' facility. The one research facility at Hoytville is on a relatively well-balanced soil. And then you look at there at Worcester, those soils are too light to really. They're those soils at the bottom of the texture triangle that I talked about earlier, that aren't very conducive to soil balance. So I think, when you look at the research that was done by Albrecht in the middle of the country, in those soils that have high clay contents there at University of Missouri, that's where he saw the response. And I think you've got to kind of look at it, where these universities are located and their research facilities. What are their research facilities like? And I think guys that have promoted the Albrecht balance have kind of given people the idea of what works in any soil, and that's really not the case. And so I think some of that has drifted into the research facilities and thinking that it works in all situations, and that's not the case.
It's a fair point, Bill. I mean, sometimes what you find is as a function of how you look and where you look, right?
Yeah.
And as the understanding of balancing affects process and effects grows, we may come to understand its limits, and maybe we began to get more reports on its limits before we began to get reports on its potential value. Will, I know that you were very gracious in starting us off today, and if it's okay, I'd like to come back to you at this point. As a farmer, but I know that there are more farmers on the line than just you. Would you be willing to elaborate a little bit on why and how you may have gotten into balancing or balancing-like approaches, and give some examples or details on some of the changes that you made along the way?
Yeah. So I also work as an agronomist and kind of loosely follow the Albrecht Method, and I started incorporating that onto my own farm. And I think it's been good. It doesn't always, finances don't always allow me to do, as much amendment, some tests would show. But I also believe that if the crop's growing well, I just use the soil report as a guideline, not a goal.
Have your amendments changed a lot? I mean, not to pry too much, you can share whatever detail you'd like. What about your budgets, the budgets associated with those changes? Just from a farmer perspective, what would you recommend a farmer know about from your experience? Farmer to farmer kind of thing, if you will.
Yeah, I try to grow nearly as much as I can rather than buy something. So that's where the livestock comes in for fertility. We buy a little bit of gypsum, but we also follow a long rotation where a fourth or more of the farm is in either pasture or cover crop fallow. And I think that resting period does us a lot of good for nutrient balancing, as well as growing our own nitrogen, tapping down into some of the, we use like alfalfa, for example. It's got a really deep taproot, and we're hoping to tap into subsoil nutrients and bring them to the surface for the row crops. We do apply a little bit of compost rather than manure, and the price is a little bit more expensive, but I find that I get a greater value out of the compost because it's alive, rather than manure, which can be pretty dead as far as microbes go. So yeah, we've adjusted inputs quite a bit. We moved away from rock phosphate and potassium sulfate. We started raising cover crops like buckwheat, and high biomass crops like rye and sorghum Sudan grass to try to increase our fertility that way rather than bringing something off the farm.
Did you have to be patient throughout that process? Were you expecting, what was your expectation with regard to the timeline of effects? Did you go into it with any specific timeline in mind, or did you just kind of let it unfold and make a decision, year to year on what you'd do next?
Yeah, I mean, things with soil are extremely slow through the eyes of a person, but in soil terms, 5 years is the blink of an eye. So it does take a long time when you're not bringing on off-farm inputs to get the point that you want. So we're still working on that, I guess. We've seen improvements, but it's slow and it takes a lot of time.
So in addition to I'm going to say something, and then you tell me if you agree or not, if you will. Bill mentioned some of the reasons why universities that have been unable to replicate some of the observations and findings that farmers have. It sounds to me like the length of experiments is another reason. They've often been short, 2 years, 3 years. Would the amount of time it takes for certain effects to unfold be another reason why the university group has been seeing something else? You have to be patient.
I believe so. It really, to see really encouraging and drastic improvements, it might take someone's career to do that research rather than a grad student taking 2 or 3 years to run a project. But
there must have been enough. Again, I want to obviously have a conversation with the many on the call here, but I'm drawn to ask. You must have seen enough of a return to continue on the process.
Yeah, I mean it's encouraging, and I think another reason, maybe researchers haven't seen similar results is, as we really start to balance the soil, like I said, our inputs are next to nothing. We buy a little bit of gypsum and some compost, and that's only ahead of our, in our fallow cover crop fallow year ahead of the corn. So we're not spending a whole lot on fertility, and maybe at least in Illinois, I think some of the researchers are tied in with fertilizer companies, and if you're not buying fertilizer, that doesn't do very well for the fertilizer companies.
True. So in all that, Will, your soil test, and I want to open this up to others too, please chime in. I know that sometimes being on the phone, it's easy to sit back, listen, and not necessarily speak up, but we do want you to speak up. Will, and all that, and others listening, when you look at a soil test report, do you look at ratios? Do you look at pH? Is there a priority for you in terms of in terms of the factors that you're looking at that's on that soil test report, and what you do next?
Yeah, we look at our calcium magnesium levels. We're on some heavy clay soil, and it does tend to be high in magnesium. Our sulfur levels have, I consider them low, so we're looking at, adding sulfur. But, really overall, we got, in central Illinois, we have some pretty good soils. So when we start looking at other micronutrients, we tend to have a pretty good supply of those. So I look at calcium and sulfur for purchase inputs, and then I look at our organic matter, phosphorus, and potassium to figure out what kind of compost or cover crops we need to raise. And then If there are, and there rarely are, if there are needs for other micronutrients, then we'll go ahead and get those too.
So, Doug J.S., Jackson Smith, if I turn you, people who use soil balancing approaches but don't necessarily call themselves balancers. Is that correct?
That's correct. And there's people who call themselves balancers who other people might not call balancers.
Okay. So how important is it that we clarify the terminology? Do we need to, or can we? What do we do instead if we don't clarify the terminology? Do we have to be really, careful in our language here, in terms of understanding somebody's input, or can we just listen, take it in, and understand it more holistically?
Kind of depends on who you are.
Okay.
I think if you're a scientist trying to set up an experiment and you want to answer a narrowly, precisely focused question, knowing exactly what we mean by soil balancing can be quite helpful, at least knowing what the specifics are so that you can, as Will said, test out whether what farmers see in the field can be reproduced or explain why it might be happening. I said earlier, it's hard to find someone who only pays attention to one thing on their farm. So in calcium-magnesium ratios is what we keyed on when we started our conversations, but that conversation invariably went in a lot of directions. It didn't always go in the same direction. So we talked to 33 people, and we often say we have 33 slightly different variants of what people practice in terms of soil balancing, and probably fewer number, but a more diverse array of what people believe should be done in soil balancing. I like what Will said at the beginning, because the other end of the extreme from a scientist wanting to be very precise and have the same definition that everyone's using would be Will's approach, which is to say, and this is what I'd say farmers generally do, is they're results-oriented, and everything they hear they have to adapt to their very unique, very specific situation in the context of a complicated system with a lot of moving parts. And I think the consultants we worked with were more concerned than the farmers about whether it was called soil balancing or not. But I think the range of things that people are doing around soil balancing is quite diverse. Now, it is helpful to know what we're talking about.
Yeah.
Who can call in on this call and say, I'm a soil balancer,
right.
And whether the rest of us would say, yes, you are, or yes, you're not. Probably doesn't matter, but it does help to have some common core. And it's generally true that the common core for what we're talking about revolves around, at least in part, managing base cations as a strategy to do a whole lot of things with your soil to achieve other objectives. But it's also true to say that while some of the scientific work is focused just on that narrow lever, almost everybody is layering on top of a calcium-magnesium focus some type of practice to manage soil chemistry, some kind of practice to manage soil biology. And if you're talking about organic farms, it's impossible to farm any other way than to manage with complicated sets of inputs. And so that if we had somebody, and we'll talk about our surveys next call, who didn't use any calcium inputs and didn't pay any attention to a base cation in their life and had no idea what, but called themselves a soil balancer, we're willing to give them the label of soil balancer, but we'll probably put them in a different category than people who do follow what we might recognize as some of the core tenets of at least an Albrecht-inspired soil balancing portfolio.
Yet another reason why the science, the science may have diverged from the practice.
Yeah, and I think scientists recognize that often it's, and we'd like to do on-farm research for that reason. On the other hand, when you do on-farm research, it becomes such a complicated setting and so many different moving parts, it's very difficult to do some of the things that at least experimental science is best at, which is really isolating what are the causal principles or what are the fundamental things going on. And so that's not a new problem, but it's definitely the case that for soil balancing, it's increasingly difficult to know how to go about studying it unless you're looking at a complicated system.
So John and Bill, a number of people in registering for the call, took the opportunity to identify themselves as a type of advisor or consultant to growers. You obviously speak with quite a few people and have spoken with quite a few growers. And why don't you follow up on what JS just shared with us? How many of those, what percent of those people have soil balancer on their mailbox, or following on their on the sign of the farm that you work with? Is it a small number, but they actually practice it?
Go ahead, John.
My response would be that many people that we work with, don't necessarily think of themselves as soil balancers, and yet they actually are very heavily engaged in soil balancing.
I would support that. These guys are whatever it takes to get better yields, better quality crops. That's what drives them. And John and I have had lots of response from different people that when we've successfully moved their fields into better balance, that farmer sees the results, and that's the real joy for me when you take a guy who knows nothing about soils, cares less, but then he says, "Wow, my soils are working a lot better now, and my neighbors are wanting to know what I'm doing different because my corn's greener. It withstands the stress better." Those type of things speaks volumes for me.
Bill, you've touched on something very important. If it's okay, I can't let it go. Are they using, and John too, are they, the folks who are using a balancing approach, are they also using a slant or build-up maintenance or any other complementary approach? Like Doug J.S. was sharing, the basic cation saturation ratios may be at the core, at the center of their ideas. But, and Will, everybody can chime in. But are people using more than that? I think that's what I've heard. I'd just like to maybe be hit with that one more time if it's actually true.
Well, for me, I'm using that combination of the cations and all the other nutrients, all the trace elements, the phosphorus, the sulfur. We're using a slant approach, a strategic level that we're trying to achieve, and with the hopes that once we balance these soils, we get better root masses, and we can operate with less inputs. And I think we see that all the time, but it's easy for me to say, well, let's treat the symptom and not the problem for the short term. And we may have to put extra stuff on because we don't get those big root masses. So, but yeah, I still use the core, the balancing in both the standard soils, balancing in the paste as well as the slant approach.
Will, if I could turn to you next, when did your thinking about soil, pretty intensely, when did that start in your farming career?
In college, I had a professor named Dr. Mulvaney who was a soils professor and really opened my eyes when it came to the soil balancing, and rather than just if something's missing on the test, adding it. I mean, there's a lot of cases where I look at a soil test, and after learning from him, I can look at a soil test and notice that, maybe my percent potassium is low, and I'd like it to be over 3, but if you look at the total pounds, I might have 600 pounds of potassium. So then I realize I need to look to figure out what's bullying the potassium out of the way.
Yeah, part of my question was about, people's understanding of, it's my understanding is that people's understanding, myself included, of soils evolves over time. And I'm curious, is soil balancing something that people come to at the beginning or towards the middle of their careers?
Well, mine started at the beginning in college.
Okay. Bill, John, Doug Doohan, anybody else want to comment on on that? I mean, is soil balancing an approach that people come to generally at the beginning or later on? Anything we can say on that?
Well, for me, Matt, it came very early in my career because I was confronted with it by a father-son operation, and in trying to talk to them about soil balancing, the father, he kind of pushed back and basically told me I was full of it, and after working on that balance for 4 or 5 years, the father, came to me and said, "Boy," he said, 5 years ago would have taken an axe to get in this ground, and 5 years ago I was full of it, but he was convinced, and so I was very fortunate early in my consulting career to have that. At the time, it was a little bit stressful, but it came early, and it was a great thing.
Doug, doing the same possibly could be true of weeds and their management. Will was talking some time ago about the steps he took and the kind of the process he went through in changing his his soils management, if you will, and not necessarily expecting immediate effects. Perhaps it's the same for weeds, and particularly as they may be affected by balancing, and even the thoughts of weed scientists, if you will, changing over time. Are you willing to comment on how your thought process around balancing may have changed over time? You alluded to it a little bit before with the research in 2011 and so on, but so maybe that's something you want to return to in some way. Don't forget the star 6. Doug, if we'll move to Steve. Steve, you and I have talked about this in different ways, and with our undergraduate students, our graduate students, and our extension stakeholders. At what point is it appropriate to begin to talk about soil balancing, and in what ways do we do that, even though the data may show that of the 3 major overall approaches, that there are some concerns about it. Clearly, there's a community that's practicing it, who are comfortable with it, but data do not necessarily, so far, and we've talked about some of the reasons for why that is, data don't necessarily support some of those claims. How do we begin to introduce it appropriately so that when people kind of move outside of that time in their life, they're not blindsided by it, or they're not completely unaware of it, or what have you? Is there from your standpoint as a person who drafts recommendations, is very much involved with drafting recommendations, how do we begin to include ones related to soil balancing while also being true to the data?
Well, it's a good question, a difficult question to answer, of course. I just go back briefly to what some of the things that Bill was mentioning in terms of why universities have not adopted this, or I think it's important. It's been an interesting process for me, very interesting to be part of this whole project, and the reaction that I've gotten from colleagues, other soil fertility folks. We can maybe talk about this later time, but in some circles, certainly very esteemed soil scientists. Soil balancing is a dirty word, and there's been a lot of resistance. And I think that there's this notion that we've done this, before. We've been down that road. Why are we revisiting that, right? It's just kind of like this is science that was decided 20-odd, 30-odd years ago. We don't need to go there again. And in the process of kind of engaging and going through this and just working on it, you can see that the science hasn't been done in some satisfyingly exhaustive way, right? There's a lot. The studies are relatively old. They weren't long-term for various reasons. There's actually not a lot of work that has been done, especially in the last 20, 30 years, virtually very, very little of it from a research perspective. I think that the beauty of science is that we, and I don't know if this is comforting or not, but we do claim to be very much so a self-correcting enterprise. And so we have paradigms that we think about and we operate under, what we believe is truth. Some of that, we know there's a large amount of uncertainty, but ultimately, and it might take a year or two, it might take 10 years, it might take decades, we believe that, truth is the foundational thing that we're after, and that we're going to, if we have it wrong now, that with time and with additional evidence, that we're gonna change the way we think about things. And so, I'll also convey that as university scientists, we are just bludgeon is probably the wrong word choice, but it seems appropriate to me. Bludgeon with all kinds of things, of products and marketing, and try this, try that, a little dab of this, a sprinkle of that, and we're all good, right? So there's a lot of, the reality is anyone can recognize is that sales drives a lot of agricultural industry. And so we try to be open-minded, but there's a bit of recognition that there's just this, in some ways, a kind of a natural skepticism that comes with the jobs that you and I do, Matt.
Right.
And so to answer, that's all background. To answer your question, when is it appropriate? Well, it's appropriate when we start to see evidence that shows that, and we believe that with sufficient time, and we have the methods to do this, that with if we start to see evidence that this is actually helping us get the end goal, that I appreciate, John mentioning, of healthier crops that yield more. That is one of my primary, I come to work with that as a primary objective in terms of what I'm intending to do to help farmers, right? So I'm more than happy to change my mind about anything I currently think about when we've got data to show it. So.
Sure. So recognizing that we're coming close to the end of the scheduled time for the conversation to conclude for today, I have about maybe a minute or two of wrap-up comments. But before I get to them, I'd like to return to the resource people and others on the call for sure, but let's begin with the six. And let's just go around the horn and ask them what they would recommend people be aware of as they leave the call today as a possible next step, or something else that they recommend they hear, or something that the resource person simply wants to say. It's not necessarily a recommendation, but it could be an observation. And a bit of a take-home nugget, if you will. Lots of very good comments have been shared here over the last hour, and we're opening up the door for just maybe one more from each of the people who respond. So if it's okay, I'll start with Will. Will, what have you not said that you would really like to leave us with?
I think as far as soil balancing goes, it's a good starting point. But that ultimately you have to get your hands and feet dirty and get out there onto the farm, really have a look around, and that should be the ultimate test right there is just in field observation.
Okay. John, are you willing to go next?
I'm not certain what I would contribute, but I've really been intrigued listening to the conversation around the question of why has soil balancing not been accepted by the universities? And a question that I'd like to put out there, I don't have the answer, but just raising it as a question, it seems to me that given there are thousands of farmers across the country who submit hundreds of thousands of soil samples every year for analysis to use a soil balancing approach, given that there is this continued acceptance by a large segment of the farming community, is it possible that perhaps the lack of adoption by the research community is a limitation of using a single factor analysis research approach instead of a multifactorial analysis perspective? Just putting that out there as a question.
Absolutely. Yeah, that could be entertained perhaps going forward, especially in the second call when the research being completed, and some of it has been completed but still is ongoing, that by people that you've heard from today, that'll be the focus of the second call. Bill, anything that you would like to leave the group with that hasn't been said or needs to be said again?
Well, I think that you've got to, like Will points out, you've got to get your hands dirty, go out there and try to figure out why this field did better than that field. Spend some money. I spend a lot of my personal money to do extra soil analysis and tissue analysis and stock analysis, trying to figure out, well, why did this field go down versus the other field? Do those analyses, try to make the comparisons, and if you struggle with trying to figure the analytical data out, there's guys like John or myself or you, Matt, you guys there can help them look at that data and maybe decipher a little bit. And it might be that you look at this and you say, well, I suggest you've got to look at go a little deeper. Look at a paste analysis. Look at stock nitrogens. Look at the next year in that rotation. Look at some early tissue analysis and those type of things. But yeah, get out there and try to figure it out. I think the knowledge is there. I certainly feel very comfortable in solving those problems, and I know John does too. So get out there and not just say, well, this one didn't perform like I thought it would. Try to figure out why.
The knowledge is there; it just may not have been tapped yet or put together yet. So
exactly.
If you're keeping track, and I would understand if you're not, but if you're keeping track, we've heard from the three folks who are not with the university so far. And now we'll turn to the three folks serving as resource people today that are with OSU, and for their final words. Doug, are you still with us? Doug Dewin, are you still with us?
Hello?
Yeah.
Okay, sorry for the trouble I had earlier. It's just my phone. And to quickly answer your previous question, Matt, it took me probably about 15 years to come around from sort of treating the notion of soil balance and weed control pretty, it's kind of a trivial, unimportant idea or unproven idea, to a place where I certainly, back a number of years ago, began to think that there had to be something going on here, that at least we needed to take a closer look at it. So it took me a while, and in my case, I'm clearly in the latter part of my career. In terms of kind of questions or comments to leave the group with today, one thing I didn't mention earlier is that in our research that's been going on since 2007, it really took me down this pathway. I would say that my sense is that amongst a lot of farmers, there's this general notion that weeds reflect some sort of imbalance or abundance or lack of something in the soil. And although that may generally be true, I think it probably is I would still say I think it's probably a disservice to the farming community in general to allow that notion to be, continue to be so prevalent. And these are amongst people who would think that some application of balancing is important. So I would hear comments like, lamb's quarters is there in the field because there's something missing, and it's doing its job of correcting that. And when it's done its job, it won't be so prevalent. I've heard the same sort of thing about Canada thistle. And Canada thistle having deep roots that bring up calcium from deep in the soil to the surface horizon. And when you correct the calcium in the surface, the thistle will be less of a problem. That's a general concern I have. But I think it would benefit all if, as the science begins to develop around the relationship between calcium and soil balancing and soil structure and weeds, that we craft those messages carefully and be sure to use them in such a way as to benefit the farmer maximally rather than just benefiting the sale of products maximally, which sometimes I think is how those ideas are used today, at least in certain circles. And then I guess the one other comment I would make is we also did see a fairly strong connection, particularly up in the northeast of this country, where the greater the more weeds the farmer had in the field, the more certain they seemed to be that if they could just get the balance right, that their weed problem would diminish, or that their weeds were caused because their soil wasn't in balance. I'm not saying that balance is not important, but what I am suggesting is that, like farmers everywhere, like human beings everywhere, people are looking for magic bullets. And probably soil balancing is not going to be a magic bullet. It may be very, we are beginning to think that it is pretty important, at least for certain types of soils. And then I guess final comment would be that, and Bill talked about this a lot, that while it may be very important in certain types, especially clay soils, it may very well not be effective and, possibly could take you in the other direction on other lighter texture types of soils. And I think we've seen some evidence that you can kind of get other nutrients such as potassium out of balance pretty quickly if you work on the calcium too hard.
Okay. Very appreciate your going back to the previous question to wrap that up. That's excellent. Steve and Doug JS, this is not quite radio, so no one's going to cut us off at precisely 3 o'clock, but recognizing that we do have just a few minutes before that time, and I need maybe 1 minute. Steve, I'll turn to you next. What would you recommend that people walk away with from the call, from your standpoint, that hasn't been said or needs to be said again?
I don't have anything super insightful. I just, Brother Matt, I just want to say I appreciate just keeping an open mind in terms of what we find and continuing the journey. So I'm just I've learned a tremendous amount from the folks that we've worked with, and I think that we're just looking forward to seeing where this takes us.
Sure.
And I'll pivot off of that and say that, I straddle both worlds, agriculture and the university, and scientists, I think, legitimately have a healthy skepticism about what they might consider to be anecdotal reports of things that people say, especially when it comes, as Doug Duhan mentioned, with the sales interest in mind, and they want us to validate that. On the other hand, farmers have a very healthy skepticism and legitimate skepticism of science, and the degree to which scientists work directly is applicable or useful in their work, and that's why they turn to farmers often and legitimately to get advice and counsel. I think the interesting thing about this project and projects like this is when you can overcome the healthy skepticism and be curious about what the other can bring to you. And I do think that there's a lot that happens when we can get scientists onto farms and farmers onto the university talking about how do we bring these two ways of knowing together more. And in the soil balancing arena, there's probably no other path forward. It's not likely to be advance what we've done the last 40 years, just relying on farmers. I think we can bring some science to the table, but science itself is never going to do it unless it's building on this wealth of experience that we hear from all these other folks who've been on the call.
Well said. More of the same will not do. And that's a perfect segue into the ending here, to the wrap up. Please note that the recording of this call will be available online. At both the Organic Food and Farming Education Research Program website, offer, and at other locations you'll find a recording of this call. Our second and third calls will be on November 14th and December 12th. They'll also be at 1:30 to 3 p.m. Eastern Time. And the scheduled resource people for call number 2 are Steve Coleman, Doug Doohan, and Doug Jackson-Smith, all here of Ohio State, plus Bob Jones of the Chef's Garden, Josh McGrath of the University of Kentucky, and Joe Nestor of Nestor Ag LLC. The focus of call 2 is, what do the numbers say about soil balancing and its effects on soils, crops, weeds, and farms? We hope you can join us for that conversation. We're going to get, quote-unquote, into the weeds a bit more, into the numbers, both from on-farm and from research station, and get down to assessing what the message is from those numbers. So again, I'd like to thank all the resource people and all of you who chimed in but were silent. We were very happy to have you, and we hope that you'll join us next time. And if you'd like, tell a friend or an acquaintance about the upcoming 2 calls. So unless there are comments that need to be said, we can sign off. Thank you. Have a good day.